so much, Dr. Azza Karam. This, like you, and I'm sure many in your audience, I've been following with sort of increasing despair, right, and pessimism, the increase in hate and intolerance and polarization and populism that's kind of infected so many different countries for more than a decade. And I've been studying organized hate in particular for around that time. Um, Increasingly felt that, well, yes, I understand the problem, I understand how it works, but what are the solutions, right? Who's doing anything about it? And I think I was driven to write this book or to explore, to start researching this book maybe 3, 4 years ago. Um, Partly for sort of traditional academic reasons, there's a research gap that I want to fill, but also for personal reasons. I felt that for my own mental health, it just simply was untenable for me to just focus on all the bad stuff that's going on around the world. And I felt perhaps I should look for not quite the silver linings, but what's being done to address this. I was convinced early on that there's no way that I was alone, right, in feeling that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. I keep meeting people who think of this as a serious problem, whether you call it polarization or intolerance or hate. And so I felt, well, if I'm not alone in sensing this problem, there must be people around the world who are trying to solve it. And so rather than delve into theory in isolation, I wanted to see what people are doing in practice.
Mhm.
So this was my hunch that there must be work going on around the world that is addressing this problem.
Mm.
I'm glad to report my hunch was proven right. I think we underestimate how much is being done because a lot of this work takes place, first of all, internationally,
Mhm.
people working locally,
Mhm.
right? And so, for example, groups working in Indonesia might not be of much interest to those fighting polarization in the United States, right? So we're divided in that sense. The work is also divided in terms of sector.
Mm.
So, for example, a lot of people that you're familiar with will be working in what we call the interfaith space that has its own language, its own sources of inspiration, its own academic literature behind it.
Mhm.
But then there are, for example, people working, coming out of political theory, democratic theory, using very different language, say the language of deliberative democracy, to do their own thing. There are groups around the world and intellectually embedded in different traditions, um, and there is not much dialogue among them. So my hunch was that if I took the effort to go around the world and look for these things with an open mind, being open to the possibility that groups may be talking about what they're doing in different ways, using different language, I might actually find that there's some common approaches among them. So I saw my role really as trying to discover these projects and try and cross-fertilize the ideas. Are there, despite the use of different terminologies, different philosophies, are there some underlying lessons that they all have independently, organically developed about how polarization can be resisted? And this book is really the outcome of that long exploration.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you for showing it. We might keep asking you to put it up there. Um, Professor Professor George, I have a question, and I will continue to ask you certainly as Cherian, but just out of utter respect for what you've done and what you will continue to do. If you were to want to get a reader who is not usually reading books about polarization to want to read this book, what would you tell them? What would be your pitch to them to read this book?
Okay, that's a great question. I suppose one thing that I have said at the outset, and I repeat at the end, and I'll share with you here, is that look, I'm not a consultant with PowerPoint slides and 5 bullet points that are going to tell you how to deal with polarization, right? That would be insulting to the audience. It would not do justice to the seriousness and complexity of the problems we face. Yeah. So much of this depends on context. Depends on historical context. It depends on cultural context. It also depends on how deep we are in the problem, right? I think what societies are able to do before polarization has become entrenched and pernicious is very different from what needs to be done when, for example, people are physically fighting, when there's a civil war going on, right? The options are different. So a lot of my book has to do with that context. It is to explain in different societies, and I cover, say, maybe 15 different countries, how they got there, where they are, what are the genuinely difficult problems that the societies face in terms of race relations, religious relations, settler-native divides, generational differences, the difficulties they have resolving trauma in the past. So there's a past versus present dimension as well. This is a complex problem. Yeah, so I take the pains to explain that context in each of these situations in a way that I hope readers that will give readers a much richer understanding, not of sort of simple soundbite solutions, but to understand why people behave the way they do, but also the opportunities that they have for bridging differences.
One of the many things I liked about your book is, and I think it reflects your journalistic background as well, because you have that experience as a journalist, is that the book is written in a way that can be easy to read for different audiences. It's not a heavily academic book, even though you have some very good theoretical grounding that you have covered, so that nobody can ever say, well, what theories are you using or what conceptual framework are you using? You've actually got that really well done. And I might ask you to elaborate a little bit later on the Chantal Mouffe the work that you've borrowed, since I too am a great fan. But for now, I think just the fact that you've been able to articulate polarization and the dynamics and the experiences that you've seen and the people that you've encountered and the practices in a way that's actually very reader friendly and very pleasant to go through. So you impart nicely. You're quite eloquent, articulate, and easy to understand, which is a big achievement in very purely academic context. So chapeau for that.
Thank you.
One of the things you said, Cherian, is that polarization is global for sure. It's not just something happening in the United States or Russia or the big countries. It's actually something that we're seeing in almost every context. And you mentioned how even within a family, we confront polarization. We have to deal with it. And it's us versus them. It's this absolutely primitive, so old way of saying, okay, there's us and there's them. And even if you don't say it, you think it. They do this, we do that. In your elaboration, you mentioned a few what I found really very good expressions. Like you mentioned the stars of the Injustice League. I'm quoting you, the stars of the Injustice. Would you care to elaborate on the stars of the Injustice League that you spoke about?
Well, I think there you've betrayed not just my desire to keep my journalistic skills sharpened, but also my love for comics and superheroes. But I mean, this is just uh, I guess a neat or cheesy way of describing authoritarian populists, which are a particular trend over the last decade or so, right? Donald Trump, of course, comes to mind, but there's many others. There's Duterte in the Philippines, the former Philippine president. There's Narendra Modi, of course. Erdogan in Turkey, and of course, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel and so on. And what political scientists have observed is that they have, even though they may situate themselves slightly differently along traditional left-right lines, there's a certain playbook. There's an authoritarian populist playbook that is now quite well understood, right? The idea of presenting themselves as the strongman savior for people who justly, justifiably feel let down by political establishments.
Mhm.
Not that they actually have any intention of serving, of addressing those grievances, but they're positioning themselves as people willing to take on the establishment, not being bound by all these conventional democratic principles, going to war for the unrecognized and the those who have felt, genuine grievances, like I said, and typically these groups, these leaders paint as the other the not just the current elites and the traditional establishment, including mainstream parties, but also, of course, they like to pick on vulnerable minorities as a convenient scapegoat for the problems that their societies are facing. And all these leaders do that, right? And of course, this makes them a key driver, a key generator of polarization. And I do want to emphasize something that is often overlooked, even though when I say it, of course, it'll be very obvious. But think of how many people, when you start a conversation with them about polarization, they blame social media.
Yes.
Right. But come on, let's blame politicians first. Politicians around the world, not just this Injustice League that I referred to, but even run-of-the-mill, fairly decent, responsible politicians are the number one source of political polarization.
Mhm.
They're the ones insisting that differences are greater than what unify us. They're the ones who cannot afford to say that, oh, actually, I agree substantially with my opponent. That's just bad branding in electoral politics. You've got to accentuate the differences to show that you are good and the other side is not so good. And this is baked into competitive politics. So politicians are up there at the top in terms of polarizing our societies.
Mhm.
And that really is so I do not want to suggest that the Injustice League are the only politicians that are guilty of polarizing our societies. It's a much wider phenomenon than that.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned that I found, I mean, again, there's lots of things, but you spoke about how the local contexts can actually, what happens in the local context can actually be very significant to reforming representative democracy, because representative democracy seems to have gone a wee bit awry. And maybe you can just elaborate that point, those 2 points a little. First, how has representative democracy gone awry? You mentioned, for instance, that governments use talk shops as a distraction, to distract people from what else is going on. That's very problematic. And the talk shops can lead to further polarization in context. But how is it that representative democracy, in your opinion, in your reading, how has that gone a bit awry? Why has that happened? But also, how come? From your various experience, what you wish to share. So again, we want to whet the appetite. We don't want people not to buy the book because I think they know it all. But what is going on? What are some of the examples that really infused you to understand and to believe that the local context and what's going on there can be helpful to saving representative democracy?
Right. So representative democracy, of course, is something that we need to protect and strengthen. But I think we also need to be aware of its limitations. I think the key point to think about is that what happens when we delegate our people-to-people relations to representatives, right? I'm convinced, and all my sources that I interviewed who are driving these local counter-polarizing projects, I think even more convinced that something is lost when we delegate our human relations to politicians, or not just politicians, in fact, representatives of any kind, because things tend to take a life of their own. They may say that they are there to represent us, but because of the way competition between organizations and parties work, we know there's what I guess what economists would call a principal agent problem. Once organizations take flight, they end up representing themselves, not necessarily they're not necessarily authentic bearers of the spirit of of the wider public. And this is quite clearly shown in surveys by political scientists in the US and elsewhere. That, for example, in the US, it's quite clear that the polarization between political elites, Republicans and Democrats, is actually greater than the polarization on the ground on many issues. Americans actually have a broad middle that broadly agree on many things. You wouldn't figure that if you just assume that Republican politicians and Democrat politicians are sort of authentic mirrors of public opinion, right? So again and again in every society, we see that partisan politicians are more polarized than the people themselves. So that's really the key point that, yes, of course, we can't go back to the days of direct democracy, if that ever existed in any country, where all citizens get to gather and deliberate on their future. There just isn't the time, and there are too many of us. Even in small countries, I come from a country of just under 4 million citizens, Singapore.
Singapore.
Even there, direct democracy is unthinkable. We have to vote for representatives who will speak for us. But I think we've got to be aware that something is lost in that process, and so the more we can return. So the idea isn't to foment a revolution that gets rid of this kind of national politics, but it is to supplement what goes on at the national level, at big scale, with political discussion, deliberation at the much more local scale, where things take on a significantly different complexion. I have a chapter on groups that are working to reform or to fine tune representative democracy, and they are convinced that, well, if you actually work on activating grassroots politics, very local politics at the city level, at the county level, of course, there are differences of opinion among citizens, but they find that it is not as polarized as national politics, because, of course, if you engage voters directly at the local level,
Mm,
you find that most of the issues that they care about are not partisan issues,
mm,
right? They want schools that are safe, that work, so where they can send their kids to school safely. They want the infrastructure to work for everybody. They want accessible healthcare. How are these red issues or blue issues? They're not.
mm,
But the same groups find that if you engage these local communities straight away with the national politics. For example, if you ask them, so are you a Trump supporter or a Kamala supporter? Immediately, this activates partisanship among ordinary people too. And then they react and respond to the political environment in partisan ways.
mm,
So what these groups tell me is that never start the conversation with what's going on at the national level.
mm,
Talk about issues that actually matter on the ground. And then you will, in fact, find that people are more alike than different.
mm. It's interesting that you say that because according to a 2024 Gallup research survey, the data seems to show that 80% of US adults actually believe that Americans are greatly divided on, and I quote, the most important values. Now, of course, we understand values, reality may not necessarily be the same thing. You mentioned, health, education, poverty, for heaven's sake. But it is interesting because I do think we're debating amongst ourselves about whether the non-political interest groups, for lack of a better word, politicians, advocates, advocacy places, lobbyists, are actually as divided. And it may be that we actually may not know, Cherian. I think we're witnessing, at least in the United States for the first time, a sense of insecurity about whether there is agreement on some very important needs related in the education space, in the public health space. I'm not sure that we're that clear that it's the politicians who are creating the divisive rhetoric, that it's the small economic or political or economic or financial elite that seems to be vested in creating that. I think there's more to be said about that certainty. I think we are
And I will say more.
Go for
I'll
it.
be happy
Hey,
to.
do say
Yeah.
more.
Um, yeah. Well, first of all, I should clarify that this book looks at what political scientists call affective polarization and not issue polarization. By affective polarization, we mean this perception that the other doesn't just have different views, but is not really deserving of equal treatment because they are perhaps stupid or immoral or what. So there's a demonization of the other, which is very different from issue polarization, where, for example, different groups in society may have very strongly divided opinions on hot button issues like abortion or gun rights, or for that matter, whether everyone should be entitled to, state-provided healthcare and so on. Yeah. I mean, of course, issue polarization is a problem because it's hard to design policies for a very divided electorate. But I would look at it together with some political scientists a different way. That issue polarization is partly a symptom of a healthy democracy. Right. I have never lived for a prolonged period other than my studies in a liberal democracy. I've always lived in authoritarian contexts.
Mm,
And to me, it's refreshing that, in democracies,
mm,
people are allowed to express strongly divided views, including views that are very different from the government. To me, that's not a problem. That's actually democracy at work, right? The last thing I would want to see is a strong consensus on major issues because I would be very suspicious.
right.
I'll be suspicious that that is actually an enforced consensus.
Mm,
So yeah, so differences over substantive policy issues to me, well, it's a problem, but it's not the problem I'm looking at. I'm looking at the difficulty that societies face when we look at those with different views, when we turn competitors or rivals into the enemy.
mhm,
Yeah, so that's the first clarification I want to make. The second is that no, I think based on not just my interviews with counter polarizers, but also reading the academic literature, it is quite clear that yes, there is a very widespread perception that there is depolarization. So
mm,
yes, absolutely, all the surveys in polarized societies will find that citizens feel that the country is extremely divided. But let's be clear, this is a perception,
mhm,
right? So we need to ask where that perception comes from. But this perception is countered by surveys that ask citizens where they stand on particular issues.
mm,
And then you find a contradiction. So the same people who answer that, yes, I feel that the country is deeply divided and I don't trust the other side, actually have opinions about policy, including on many values that are strikingly similar to the other side. So there's a mismatch between reality and perception. And this is serious because, I mean, some political scientists even call it false polarization, but I think that's taking it too far because, yes, it may be a misperception, but it's very real because if you are convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the other side cannot be trusted and is evil, you're going to act that way.
Yes.
You're going to withhold cooperation. You're even going to maybe even deny them the rights that you feel entitled to. So it's very real, even though it's a misperception. And then I ask, okay, so where does this misperception come from?
Mhm.
Right? Who's making people believe that the those who are unlike them cannot be trusted? And here, yes, I go back to politicians who are telling us all the time that the other side is someone you got to beat. But not just politicians, definitely not just politicians. This is also where social media come in.
Yes.
The great problem with social media, and I think most people sense this. Most people are, well, many people are almost addicted to social media, but the same people will tell you they hate it.
Mhm.
Right? They hate the
Yes, I've heard
social
that,
media
yes.
environment because it highlights everything that is negative, right? It just brings out the worst in other people and so on. So the thing that is quite uniformly the case with the major social media platforms um, is that they tell us that the world is an ugly place,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
I don't, unless you're dealing with very closed communities on social media, if you're exposed to the wider world of social media, and of course, right now, X would be the prime example, people come away from it really feeling that, oh man, these people who think differently from me are really, they're monsters. Yeah. Of course, you won't feel that way about your own group because you have direct access to real breathing representatives of your own group. So you're not going to stereotype that way. But if you don't have personal ties with the other side, you might gradually come to believe that because of exposure to the nastiness on social media, that the other side really is full of monsters. Um, and unfortunately, I mean, as someone who, as you say, has been a journalist a long time as well, I don't think the mainstream, responsible, good faith media off the hook either, because there's been decades of research that mainstream news cultivate what's called a mean world syndrome, right? That heavy consumers, especially of TV news, come away thinking that the world is in worse shape than it is, right? Because the news, almost by definition, treats conflict as more newsworthy. So consistently, we find that people who are more exposed, in particular to TV news, exaggerate the amount of crime that there actually is in society, feel that the world is a darker place than it is. So I would say that I classify all these three actors, the political class, mainstream media, and social media, as problematic middlemen, right, who are mediating our relations with one another. That so much of our impressions of distant strangers is mediated by these three groups. And what's similar about these three groups for different reasons, but all of them give us a bleaker view of the other side than the facts warrant. So therefore, it should not at all be surprising that when Americans or any other group in a polarized society is asked, what do you think on the other side? You're going to get negative answers.
Mm. So this actually is a perfect segue to what you describe in the book when you're quoting Chantal and at the same time the similarity between what she maintains and what the Colombian President Manuel Santos, the former president who's a peacemaker and the recipient of the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize, they both maintain that one needs to distinguish between adversaries and enemies, right? So there's a category of enemies and a category of adversaries. And you mentioned that they both say that, well, with enemies, you kind of have to, you tend to think of eliminating your enemies, but with adversaries, you have to think of beating them as opposed to eliminating.
And living with them, because you have to live
them.
with them.
Okay,
Yeah.
that point, by the way, hasn't quite come up quite as strongly, but about beating them, that did come out very, very so. Maybe you could help us understand that point, enemies versus adversaries, and why we've ended up, as you were just describing, in a context where we tend to see the other who disagrees or who may have different values, or who may be non-native or whatever form of othering we have, as an enemy. What does it take? And I think you did describe that in your book very nicely through the
Right.
different facets of experience, but maybe you could give us a taste of what you saw and what you noticed about enemy versus adversary.
Sure. I think it's important to ask ourselves, if we find polarization a problem, if we find populism a problem, and so on, what is the desired end goal, right? So as I've mentioned before, I certainly would push back against the notion that the end goal is that we all think alike, right? Or that we come to a consensus on the majority of issues. That to me does not sound like a real democracy. Yeah. And this is why I found the work of Chantal Mouffe as well as Nancy Fraser very powerful, because they distance themselves from other political philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, who put a lot of stock in reasoned debate and coming to some kind of rational consensus. Chantal Mouffe and Nancy Fraser both have a much more radical understanding of democracy. They're suspicious of the idea that we could ever fix the society could fix its positions, because they know, partly based on feminist theory, that any kind of consensus is bound still to be exclusionary. Right, and the people who are excluded tend to be the usual suspects, women to start with, and other minorities, and so on, who, even if there is formal equality, even if there's access formally open, there's still various codes that keep some groups out of the mix. Yeah, so they believe in a much more radically open form of participation and deliberation. So that's point one. The second is, okay, but what are the limits of that participation? And here again, I like the fact that they're both extremely open about, what are the minimum requirements for viable democratic dialogue, right? And Move is very clear about this, and I think it's worth spending time on chewing on her words. She says that, look, for democratic dialogue, we just need everyone to acknowledge that the other has equal rights, that they are equally entitled to freedom and equality, and that's it.
But isn't that
Right?
precisely where we're stuck?
Yes, so it's actually
Right.
a big ask. It is a big ask, and I'll come to that. But it's also important to remember that it's extremely inclusive, because, of course, in practice, even in democracies, even among liberals, you could even say, especially among liberals now, there is a desire to exclude those with views that they find beyond the pale or unpleasant, right? For example, those with fundamentalist religious beliefs and so on, those who are too far to the right. Yeah. There's a tendency to say, well, they shouldn't be part of our polity.
Right.
They should be cancelled. They should be deplatformed. And I think Move is very clear that no, you've got to leave the space open, sincerely open. But yes, even this requirement that that we respect one another's equal freedom and dignity is a big ask. Why is it a big ask? And I think back to I mean, when I think about why it has been so disappointing for those of us who have not had the privilege of growing up or living in a liberal democracy to see what is happening in liberal democracies, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that,
Yeah.
right? That countries that I once admired for having the right principles have
Yeah.
gone so severely off track.
Yeah.
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 My guess is that it is not because the founding principles are wrong. I mean, I'm a great admirer of the values underlying liberal democracies. Yeah. So where did it go wrong? I suspect that it went wrong in the first line of the Bill of Rights, right? Which let me explain.
Yes, please. Yes,
What's the
please.
first line? It says we hold these truths to be self-evident, right?
It isn't. They're
That is, it's not self-evident. It is not self-evident.
yes. They're not.
Right?
They were self-evident to that lot, to that group.
Well, I'm
Very
not even
small
sure if it was
elite group, by the
I'm
way.
not even sure if it was self-evident to them, right? It's an aspirational statement.
Yes.
They're extremely valuable values,
Mhm.
but we're kidding ourselves. And I think this is where liberal democracies went wrong. They
Mhm.
kidded themselves. They took that aspirational statement literally, and they didn't do the work of convincing more and more people, the unending work of convincing their fellow citizens year by year through their school system, through their political speeches, whatever influence they could bring to bear, to make people realize that these truths might not be self-evident, but we're going to persuade you that this is the only basis on which to build a collective and peaceful life. So, in short, I think where liberal democracies failed is an absence of civic education.
Mhm.
There is, of course, some of it in schools, but from what I understand, in many liberal democracies, civic education amounts to learning history.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and less,
And some
and of
parts of
course, they
history,
may.
not all of history. History is
Right, that's right.
redacted and edited
That's right.
according to the dominant
Yes.
ruling group.
And of course, they might know their constitutional rights and so on, but is
Might.
are these fundamental values that MOVE talks about, um, is that really convincingly sold to the majority of people? Now we can say no, it wasn't. The evidence is clearly there that it wasn't, and I think this is why it is so hard to sell. I mean, I think the American founding fathers and other nation builders were right
Mhm.
that there is great appeal to the idea that I should have rights.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that yes, I am born free. I have the right to pursue liberty and happiness and so on. That's an easy sell, which is why there has been a democratic revolution around the world, which is why everyone basically loves democracy, right? Nobody's going to deny themselves of democracy. But here's the difficult part, right? It's reciprocity that's the difficult part.
Right.
Yeah. Where we have failed is in convincing most people that the same rights that I value for myself
Mhm.
must be given or must be acknowledged in everyone else,
Mhm.
including your worst enemies. That is a very hard sell,
Indeed.
right? It
Indeed.
is extremely difficult, even for citizens of established democracies, to accept that the same rights that they treasure
Mhm.
are equally belong to those who are different.
True. Absolutely. Very well put. And I think that reminds me of something that you spoke about in your book, which is the acts of performative love juxtaposed against the acts of performative hate. And perhaps one could say, and you can always correct me, that performative love, to perform love in your life, is precisely predicated upon the fact that you have to accept that the other, whom you may hate, deserves exactly the same rights as you do. Therein lies the heart the problem, which is that we may talk love, but we actually ultimately believe that we are entitled to a different set of life, of realities, of rights, of dignity than the other. Because what do you mean we all are in the same space? But performative love is to perhaps see yourself like the other and
Mhm.
as entitled as the other. And maybe that's the hardest thing about liberal democracy. Even in liberal democracy, we didn't quite get there because authoritarian regimes are relatively clear. No, it's this group
Mhm.
and this group only that deserves A, B, C, D. Anyone else is an enemy, not an adversary, an enemy that needs
That's
to
right.
be put at bay or fought or whatever. And that doesn't just, by the way, apply to authoritarian regimes, because as we saw from the Gaza genocide, it applies even to so-called democratic regimes. They
Of
also
course.
delineate us and them. They also see the other group as absolutely not deserving of the same
Mhm.
dignity that their own group deserves. So it isn't just liberal democracies. It might be those who think they are, but we've come to a stage where that which distinguishes liberal democracy from the other, authoritarianism, might actually be exactly the same as that which characterizes authoritarianism.
Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe just in respectful of your time, and I know that we're coming up to 10 minutes to the hour, I would love for you to say a little bit more about when you were talking about the interfaith experiment that you witnessed and you juxtaposed the situation you saw in Ambon, Indonesia, with India, and in a way the rising extremism that we see in India, the exclusivism that we see. You specifically spoke about the example of Ambon, and you mentioned the role of women who they let their men do their thing and ultimately talk other each other, but they came together and said, now look here, we have some very basic needs that both communities have, Christian and Muslim. Let's make sure that those get attended to. And in fact, as a Christian, I'm going to help the Muslim, and as a Muslim, I'm going to help the Christian women, because we know that our families require this. And it was striking to me because, no, obviously not just because I'm a woman and somebody who's interested in what women do, but because you actually saw that and you spoke to it. And it occurs to me that that's not just something that happens in Ambon, that in multiple cases, and Moof refers to that in some of her work, but as does Nancy Fraser, it somehow takes the feminist and or the women perspective and women's interest as bearers of carers and nurturers of families to somehow go against some of those otherwise very rigid divides between us and them. Did you notice that in the other contexts that you talk about in your work, in your book, beyond the Ambon example, which you described very, very well? Did you see it in other contexts, even in India, which you juxtaposed for the interfaith work? Did you see that role of the women as being different from what the men wanted or said?
Yeah, I think it was especially striking in my interviews in Indonesia that they were very self-consciously talking about the special role of women. It didn't emerge as much in the other chapters. I'm still undecided about whether there's particularly woman's view of the world that is some that will bring us peace and so on. I see you're
No, no,
skeptical as
no,
well.
no, no.
You know, I'm afraid
I'm not saying that.
to
I'm not even intimating or alluding to that. I just
yeah.
found it fascinating that you saw
Of
that.
course, yes,
Yeah, of
exactly. Yeah, it's very interesting. So, but I wouldn't, of course, want to essentialize women who
course. No.
I'm sure are equally capable of starting wars, right?
You've got examples of
But
that.
I
Yeah.
think that the broader lesson from that is the idea of us being diversely different, in the words of Amartya Sen, and us having multiple identities
Mhm.
that may be cross-cutting. I think that's very profound, and that's I think the other theoretical one of the theoretical foundations of the book,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
it's not that identities don't matter, of course they do,
Mm.
but the con job that is performed by polarizers and populists and so on is to convince us that only one
Identity
identity
matters.
reigns supreme,
Right.
right? And that we should be guided in our political conduct and our social relations by that one identity. That's the con, right? We are made up of multiple identities, and in fact, one of the most human and empowering things about our existence is each individual's ability to pick which identity is going to be more salient at which time.
Mm,
And we do it throughout the day, in fact.
absolutely.
We code switch, we switch fluidly among our different identities, and that's what makes life richer and more meaningful. And we've got to fight back against this idea that only one identity counts. So I think that the lesson to be drawn from those women's group in Indonesia is the self-conscious way in which they were able to find they were able to make their religious identities less salient
Mm,
and to remind themselves and one another that look, we have other identities on which we can do business, right? And in fact, that mean a lot more to us. And in that case, it was their identity as mothers and wives. Yeah.
caretakers.
But similarly, in other contexts, so for example, in my chapter on electoral politics, I looked at what's going on in Turkey, the role that women played in Indonesia is played by youth in Turkey who come to the similar conclusions, right? That youth, and this by this I mean mainly people in their 20s, early 30s, and so on, have come to the conclusion that look, none of the established political parties are working especially hard to solve our problems, right? We face the prospect of long unemployment, going to university is very expensive, housing is unaffordable, and so on. Let's come together, regardless of whether we identify more as, with the more religiously conservative party or with a more secular party. Let's come together because we're youth, right? And this works. So I think that's the lesson I draw from it. The idea that even in highly polarized context, and in the case of Indonesia, this is a real bloody civil war, right? It's not just the sort of psychological polarization. People are killing each other. Even in those contexts, it is possible for people on either side of a divide to remind themselves that no, wait, there are other identities that we share that we can activate. And that to me was a very powerful lesson.
Indeed, and you described it very beautifully throughout your book. And I think there's only two questions. One is really more a contention. The other is a question. The contention would be that you can, especially when it comes to your identity as a woman or as a, let's say, a Muslim or a Christian, that you can actually choose, even within that one identity, you can choose which narrative you wish to espouse and live by.
Absolutely.
Because the whole point about religious narratives is there is the put in use and there is the text and the interpretations. And I think what I subsumed from what you were describing in the context of Ambon is that and even in with the youth in Turkey, is that it is a part of that identity, same identity, being a
Yeah,
young person or being a Muslim or being a Christian. You decide to activate the performative love inherent in that very same
mhm,
identity, as
right.
opposed to the performative hate that it could also lead to
Yes,
and is also
that's
inherent
right.
in that identity. And so that aspect of the agency of the individual in the group or the community or the activists or the politicians to choose which narrative they're going to, even
Mhm.
within the one identity, to choose which
That's right.
narrative
That's right.
they will leverage in a public way
Yeah.
to gain. And I think what we're struggling with, and that's my question, is that where you see at the local level, and you described it very well in terms of the civic participation dynamics that somehow are far better than the political narrative and vying for power, but at the civic participation level, um, how do we take that, Cherian, from this local context where this is happening and it is good and it is healing and it is not only healing us as communities in spite of really traumatic, horrible stuff, but it can provide a way of coexistence that is based on peaceful reciprocity. How do we take it from there to a global level, which doesn't really allow for the context, the communal, the civic, may even look down upon the civic entirely. If it allows for it to be, it'll be as fifth grade citizens, if at all, with equal amount of representation or none at all. In these, I'm thinking the United Nations, the regional organizations, intergovernmental networks, places like the World Economic Forum, where the civic and civil society don't really come unless they're really wealthy.
Mhm.
How do we translate, do you think? What are,
Yeah.
how do we take it from here to the global?
Yeah, I think you've nailed exactly one of the biggest limitations of the projects that I've looked at, right? Uh, and this is something I realized at the very start of it, that there is a scalability problem. Yeah. These projects work wonderfully, and there's evidence to show that it works wonderfully at the small scale, and for good reason, because so much of it depends on person to person, face to face interaction, where we're able to see one another as whole human beings,
Mm,
right? Rather than just as sound bites in a story or as data points on some survey, right? I can relate to you and I realize that you are many things all at once, right? You're not just cardboard cutout stereotype of whatever, right? You're many things, and that allows that human connection. So if it is so dependent on interpersonal connection, face to face, how
mhm,
do you scale up?
mhm,
Um, and unfortunately, I think you can't. Right? If you're talking about, say, interfaith dialogue, which may work at when you have 50, maybe maximum 100 people in a room, can you do the same thing in a stadium? The way a charismatic preacher might.
mhm,
You can't, because it's a different kind. You're trying to achieve something different. You're not trying to project the charisma of one speaker speaking to 100,000. You're trying to cultivate human connection. And that's difficult to do in a stadium, right? Let alone in a city of 2 million, even less likely in a country of 200 million. So you can't, and so therefore the even before we get to the international level, even getting to the city or the to the national level, all you can do really is to replicate these as much as possible,
mhm,
and hope that the social capital that you develop through these multiple, replicated forums for dialogue and deliberation, multiple opportunities for, meaningful encounters, builds enough social capital that will be able to resist the next um, partisan or communal call from a leader.
mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm,
That the next time a leader tries to exploit religion for political gain, there'll be enough awareness, enough resistance and resilience within the community that's been built up through these multiple efforts. And that really is the only way. That there's no quick fix, right? It's not a question of national policy. It's about trying this wherever it works. Then you come to the even more difficult problem of how do you do this internationally. Uh, if I had more time, um, uh, and more funds to travel the world, I guess that would have been another chapter in the book. I did actually want to ask, is there stuff going on at the international level
mhm,
to address what is probably the most polarizing divide in the world right now, yeah, which
mhm,
is the divide between nation states.
mhm,
We almost don't even think about it most of the time.
mhm,
In fact, we don't,
mhm.
because the idea of national divide is hegemonic
Right,
in a very literal sense that, it has become the common sense,
right.
right? Uh, there's so much discussion about how to counter partisan polarization and religious polarization,
Mhm,
but where's the discussion of how we transcend our national identities with some sense of humanism, right? Where is that discussion going on that we should be thinking of ourselves as members of the human species and not automatically think of ourselves as citizens of a particular country? That those discussions really happen on the fringe. It is seen as a bit loony and idealistic,
Yeah.
right? But it needs to be mainstreamed, but it never is. And again, I would put the blame partly on media, not just social media, in fact,
I agree. I
even
agree.
more so on news media,
Yes.
because most news media, in fact, practically all news media
Like the
around the world, regardless of the political system that they come from,
Mhm.
are either national or subnational,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
There are hardly any major media brands that say that no, we are going to promote internationalism in the style of the old communists, right?
Mhm.
Or humanism,
Mhm.
that we are going to religiously see connections between people across borders. So where's that work being done? My hope is that in fact some of that work is being done, and like I said, if I had the opportunity to add an additional chapter, it would be an exploration of counter-polarizing spaces that transcend nationalism. I'm actually toying with the idea of making that my next book,
Mhm.
provisionally titled "The Strongest Ism," right? That of all the ideologies in the world, nationalism is the one that is least questioned, but the one that needs the most questioning, because our instinct to think of ourselves as members of a nation state at the expense of our shared humanity is obviously causing us serious problems, whether it's addressing war or conflict or the climate crisis. Yeah.
So brilliant. Thank you. And I think it bears deliberation, what you call good deliberation, um, as to a couple of important aspects. One is that I remain someone who's looking to the global interfaith movement, the international interfaith movements, as a catalyst for precisely that kind of scaling up of the narratives of performative love, from the local to the regional to the global, because ostensibly the religion is the transnational, is the quintessential transnational narrative, right? Religions are not limited by countries, borders of nation states. They maintain, each of them, that they are transnational. Indigenous traditions are not limited by national boundaries. They are, obviously, because of what's happening in our nation state context, but in principle, the sacred is earth, and earth is not divided and divisible. So if we were to accept that the religious is transnational, doesn't acknowledge national boundaries, then therein lies the potential and indeed the imperative for not being limited to the local context, for being able to scale, replicate, and learn from and bring to the global that which is the performative love in its manifest. Another idea that comes very close to this is what we're seeing happen in the ecological movement, in movements around climate change and the environment, where there is indeed an argument that, look, this is not something that's going to stop at the borders. The lack of clean air and water and enough food and being able to look after this environment is not limited to any country. We're actually harming each other very effectively, really fast, and heading towards a very bad place together, which won't be limited to one place. There's no safe place that you can carve out. So those movements actually do have, at least inherent within what it is that they're trying to do, this logic that you have to save the world altogether, and everybody has got to do it, and it is not limited to one space. So in principle, there is potential, if you will, but what we're lacking and what everybody complains about is the political will, because political will brings us to where you've elaborated so clearly. We've got a bit of an impasse here, and I think the question then is, as long as you remain bound by your national territorial boundaries and the nation state as we know today, which is what we've got, we haven't got anything else, right? then we will be confronting that dilemma. It's not the absence of issues or performative love. It is the fact that you can't take it beyond the levels at which it is at now. But if we hold the interfaith accountable, which I think we should and nobody does, then we're going to have to say, why aren't you manifesting your belief that you are transnational, you are not limited, and replicating and scaling up that which is the common good and for the common good? Why are you not doing that? Why are you still bound by what this politician, what this nation state, what this political party, what this interest group in financial terms dictates? Why are you bound by that when you're supposed to be serving the world, not just any particular nation? That question never gets asked of interfaith movements, Cherian. And I think it is high time it does, because it is absolutely critical to your point and many who have maintained that it is the civic that can ultimately transform the global reality. Well, no better civic than he or she who believes that what they believe in belongs to everybody.
It's universal, that's right.
And therein is also where we're struggling, because the human rights movement has come to the same impasse. It's become too focused on specific human rights. It's as if human rights is not indivisible and completely universal. It's as if, no, it's about the set of rights, as opposed to the entire reality of human rights that is quintessentially interconnected. You can't claim one right at the expense of the other. It doesn't work that way. And yet this is where the human rights movement has brought us, into empires on specific rights. And if we don't have faith in the human rights movement, then we're going to have to hold even more accountable the interfaith movement, because they think they don't need human rights, you see. Well, then, if you don't need human rights, what are you basing it on? That which is quintessentially. So how come we ain't seeing that? But anyway, much to discuss. Professor Cherian George, an absolutely delightful conversation. Thank you so much. When does the book come out?
Well, it's already out in the UK. It should reach the US by the end of the year or the turn of the year.
Okay, that's next month. We've only got a couple more weeks at most. Congratulations on an excellent book. I can't wait to see
you so
you
much.
sign my copy when I get it, which I will now endeavor to get, not via Amazon, but any other means. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you for your